In a decision echoing through government and global markets, the High Court has delivered a decisive check on executive power. The court has halted the sweeping tariffs enacted during the Trump administration, fundamentally altering American economic strategy. This is more than a reversal of trade policy, it's a statement on the constitutional limits of presidential authority. For years, these tariffs shaped prices and international relations. Now, their sudden halt forces a reckoning over who makes such monumental economic decisions. Industries long burdened by tariffs see relief, while those protected must adapt to global competition. The ruling closes a contentious chapter in trade history and opens a new one, shifting the power to reshape trade relationships back to Congress. The High Court's intervention addresses a core constitutional conflict: the expansion of presidential power at Congress's expense. By striking down the tariffs, the court affirms that even in emergencies, the executive cannot wield powers not clearly granted by Congress. This decision will be studied for its economic impact and its defense of the separation of powers. The ruling is the result of a long legal battle by businesses arguing the tariffs were an unlawful use of emergency powers. As the nation absorbs this historic decision, the focus shifts to Congress and the White House to chart a new path for America's global economic role. The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The framers placed this authority with the legislature to prevent unchecked executive control, a lesson from British rule. Over time, Congress delegated some trade powers to the President for flexibility in fast-moving global events. Laws like the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974 gave the President limited authority to adjust tariffs. This delegation blurred constitutional lines, setting up conflicts over where Congress's power ends and presidential power begins. The recent tariff dispute brought this tension to a head, focusing not just on economic wisdom, but on legal authority. Opponents argued the president was legislating from the White House, usurping Congress's constitutional role. The High Court's decision reasserts congressional authority, clarifying that Congress can grant flexibility but cannot cede its core responsibilities. The ruling is a reminder: major shifts in economic policy require the consent of the people's representatives, not unilateral executive action. It reinforces the principle that regulating foreign commerce is a legislative function. At the heart of this legal battle is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a 1977 law meant for true emergencies. IEEPA was designed as a scalpel for foreign policy crises, not a sledgehammer for domestic economic restructuring. The Trump administration's use of IEEPA to justify broad tariffs on China was a controversial stretch of the law. The administration claimed trade practices were a national emergency, expanding IEEPA's scope from security threats to economic competition. Critics argued this was a misapplication. Congress never intended IEEPA for sweeping tariffs as industrial policy. Legal briefs showed IEEPA was for urgent threats, not multi-year trade overhauls. The High Court sided with this narrow interpretation, ruling the administration's use of IEEPA was an overreach. The decision sets a precedent. General economic challenges don't meet the legal standard for invoking emergency powers. Future presidents are now limited in using IEEPA for broad economic policies. The ruling reaffirms that emergency powers are not a blank check for executive action. The major questions doctrine was central to the legal challenge against the tariffs. This doctrine says that for executive actions with vast economic impact, Congress must give clear, specific authorization. Opponents argued the tariffs were a textbook major question, not a routine action, but a move with profound national consequences. The administration needed to show Congress clearly authorized this use of IEEPA, but challengers argued no such statement existed. The burden was on the government to prove Congress intended to give the president power to remake trade policy single-handedly. The High Court agreed. IEEPA's broad language was meant for emergencies, not for Congress to hand over its core trade authority. The ruling is a victory for the major questions doctrine, affirming that executive actions with sweeping impact require explicit congressional approval. It prevents the executive from creatively reinterpreting old laws for major policy shifts. The decision strengthens Congress's role in making the nation's most important economic decisions. The High Court's decision followed a series of warnings from lower courts. Judges at the Court of International Trade and the Federal Circuit had already questioned the administration's broad use of tariff powers. A key appellate panel expressed skepticism that IEEPA could justify long-term tariff policy focusing on separation of powers. Earlier rulings found the administration had overstepped, establishing that executive power in this area is subject to judicial review. These lower court decisions emboldened challengers and clarified the constitutional stakes. By the time the case reached the High Court, a strong record of judicial doubt had been established. The final decision was the logical conclusion to a long legal battle over executive authority. The tariff case's journey to the High Court was marked by years of legal challenges from American businesses. Initial lawsuits argued the tariffs were illegal and violated procedural limits, making them arbitrary and capricious. As the case moved from the Court of International Trade to the Federal Circuit, the focus shifted from procedure to constitutional questions. The challengers argued misuse of IEPA and violation of the separation of powers, elevating the dispute to a major constitutional confrontation. The administration's unwavering defense ensured the conflict would reach the Supreme Court. Each judicial level added analysis, clarifying the issues and raising the stakes. The process demonstrated the resilience of the courts in resolving fundamental disputes over government power. By the time the case reached the High Court, the legal arguments were sharply defined. The winning legal argument was simple. The executive can only act within powers explicitly granted by law. Challengers argued the administration overreached by using IEPA, a law for foreign crises, to restructure trade policy. Lawyers dissected IEPA's text and history, showing it was meant for emergencies, not long-term economic competition. The administration's broad interpretation stretched the statute beyond its intent, effectively creating new law without Congress. This was a clash between a flexible executive and a presidency bound by congressional limits. Allowing the executive to reinterpret statutes would erode legislative power and upset constitutional balance. The High Court sided with the constrained view, ruling the executive's interpretation of IEPA was not plausible. The power to impose significant tariffs was not granted by Congress through IEPA. The decision underscores, the executive cannot expand its authority by creatively rereading the law. Lawmaking power remains with Congress. This ruling is a defense of the separation of powers, a bedrock constitutional principle. The tariff case tested whether the executive had encroached on Congress's explicit powers. Had the court upheld the tariffs, it would have set a precedent for presidents to bypass Congress using emergency powers. Such a move would weaken Congress and concentrate power in the executive. The judiciary's role is to keep the branches within their constitutional lanes. By striking down the tariffs, the court reaffirmed that the president's authority is constrained by law and the Constitution. The decision is a victory for the constitutional order, ensuring major policy decisions go through the legislative process. It upholds the separation of powers as a meaningful, enforceable principle. With the High Court's decision, the U.S. stands at a crossroads in economic strategy. The ruling ends the use of emergency powers for broad tariffs, returning trade policy to Congress. Now lawmakers must forge a new consensus on engaging with the global economy, especially with competitors like China. Congress must decide whether to legislate tariffs, pursue new agreements, or take a different approach, requiring bipartisan cooperation. The outcome will define American economic policy for years. The decision also opens the door to repairing strained alliances and pursuing multilateral solutions. Ultimately, the court has clarified the rules. Now it's up to elected leaders to shape America's economic future. The nation must answer, will Congress rise to the challenge, or will gridlock leave businesses and workers in uncertainty?